The walls of her small home were silent, safe from the distant murmur of voices outside, faint echoes of a world that had carried on without her. The dim light from a single oil lamp flickered across the rough stone floor, casting shadows that stretched and curled like grasping fingers, reaching for something that was no longer there. She sat in the corner, her knees drawn close, her hands resting lightly on the worn fabric of her robe. She had lived in this quiet for 12 years. 12 years of being unseen, untouched, unwanted. There had been a time before, a time when her life had been full. She could still remember the sound of laughter in her father's courtyard, the warmth of her mother's hands brushing through her hair, the way her friends had once called her name without hesitation. She had been part of the world then, walking freely through the marketplace, gathering with the women at the well, sitting in the temple to hear the scriptures spoken aloud. But then, the bleeding had begun. At first she had thought it would pass, as it always had. A natural cycle, a part of life. But the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. And still, it did not stop. The whispers had begun soon after. At first they were quiet, words of concern, gentle suggestions, prayers murmured in her presence. But then, the concern turned to something else. Fear. She was unclean. The law was clear. A woman who bled was impure, separated from the community until the flow ceased. But hers never did. The healers came first, men who claimed to know the ways of the body, who pressed their hands to her skin and promised that with the right herbs, the right prayers, the right sacrifice, she would be healed. She had believed them. She had clung to their words like a drowning woman reaching for a rope, but the treatments had done nothing. The bleeding continued. Then came the others, the ones who whispered of secret remedies, of rituals performed in the dead of night, of cures that required more than medicine. She had been desperate enough to try them all. She had paid every coin she had traveled from one healer to the next, had submitted herself to remedies that left her weak, shaking, humiliated, and still, nothing changed. One by one, the people in her life had faded away. First, the women who had once sat beside her, their voices bright with chatter, their hands weaving baskets in the midday sun. They had begun to avoid her gaze, stepping aside when she passed too close, whispering behind their hands. Then, the temple. She had gone as long as she could, standing at the outer courts, hoping, praying that God would see her, that He would remember her. But she had seen the way the priests avoided her, the way the worshippers pulled their robes away, unwilling to risk becoming unclean themselves. And then, her family. They had tried at first to help, but as the years passed, their patience grew thin. She could see the sorrow in her mother's eyes, the helplessness in her father's. She could hear the quiet conversations late at night when they thought she was asleep, the murmured words of exhaustion, of shame. And so one day she had left. Not because they had asked her to, but because she could not bear the weight of their pity any longer. Now, 12 years later, she existed on the outskirts of life, neither fully alive nor truly dead, a shadow slipping through the world unnoticed. Until today. Because today, she had heard his name. It had been nothing more than a passing conversation, two women speaking in hushed voices outside her window. She had not meant to listen, but when she heard the name, she had stilled, her heart pounding against her ribs. Jesus of Nazareth. She had heard of him before. Rumors whispered in the marketplace, stories carried from town to town of a man who healed the sick, who touched lepers without fear, who cast out demons with a single word, a man who did not turn away from those deemed unclean, a man who, it was said, had the power of God Himself. Her breath had caught as she pressed herself closer to the wooden frame of the window, straining to hear. The women spoke of miracles, of the blind receiving sight, of the lame walking, of the dead being raised, and then, "He is coming here." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her robe. Could it be true? Could she believe? Dare she hope? After so many years of disappointment, of failed remedies, of prayers that had gone unanswered. She closed her eyes. She had nothing left. No money, no family, no future. And yet, she still had one thing: faith. The morning light stretched long across the rooftops as she rose from the corner of her small home, her legs trembling beneath her. She pulled her cloak tightly around herself, hiding the frailty of her frame, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not know what she would say to him. She did not even know if she would speak at all. But she knew one thing: if she could just touch the hem of his robe, she would be healed. And so, with one deep breath, she stepped outside, leaving behind 12 years of isolation, 12 years of sorrow, 12 years of being unseen. She did not look back, because today she would not be invisible. Today she would be made whole. She moved through the narrow streets, her hands trembling beneath the folds of her robe, her breath shallow as she pulled the hood over her head. She had learned to walk unnoticed, to avoid the eyes of those who knew her, to keep her distance from the world that had cast her aside. But today, she could not stay hidden. Jesus was near. She could hear it in the voices of the people, their excitement, their urgency. The crowd was swelling, pressing toward the place where he walked. "He's coming this way." Did you see what he did in Capernaum? A leper was healed just by his touch. They say he speaks with an authority like no other, greater than the teachers of the law. The murmurs surrounded her, pressing in like a tide, sweeping her forward before she could second guess what she was doing. She was weak. Years of suffering had drained her body of its strength, but something inside her, something stronger than her frail limbs, kept her moving. She had to reach him, even if she had to fight through the crowd, even if it cost her everything. As she turned the corner, the air grew thick with dust, kicked up by the feet of dozens, no, hundreds of people who had gathered. And then she saw him. Jesus. He was moving slowly, speaking to those closest to him, his steps unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. His presence was different from anything she had ever seen. There was no arrogance in the way he walked, no superiority in his expression. He did not carry himself like the religious leaders who held their robes tightly to keep themselves clean, who avoided the sick, the broken, the unworthy. He moved among them, with them, as if he belonged to them, as if they belonged to him. Her breath caught in her throat. Hope surged through her chest, fierce and unrelenting. She stepped forward, only to be shoved back. The crowd was too thick, the people too eager, too desperate. They surged around him, reaching for him, calling out his name. "Rabbi, please, my son. He is sick. Lord, have mercy on me. Teacher, come to my house. My daughter is dying." Her heart pounded wildly. She would never reach him like this. She was too small, too weak. She had no voice loud enough to call his name, no standing to demand his attention, but she had faith. And faith did not need to be seen. Faith only needed to reach. She took a deep breath and dropped lower, pressing through the gaps between bodies, moving through the spaces where the crowd was not looking. Hands shoved against her, feet stepped too close, dust coated her skin, but she did not stop. Closer, closer. He was right there, just beyond her fingertips. Her body ached, her knees shook, her vision blurred, but she did not hesitate. She stretched out her hand, and her fingers brushed the hem of his robe. A surge of power flooded through her, warm and immediate, like a rushing river washing over parched land. It shot through her body, filling every part of her, mending what had been broken for 12 long years. The bleeding stopped. The weakness disappeared. The weight of her suffering lifted in an instant. She gasped, her fingers tightening briefly on the fabric before she released it, her body trembling, not with sickness but with awe. She had been healed. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to collapse in relief, to sob into the dust, to laugh and cry and shout all at once. She had done it. She had touched him, and she was whole. But before she could slip away, before she could disappear into the crowd and return home in silent joy, a voice broke through the murmurs around her, a voice that silenced every other sound. "Who touched me?" Her breath caught in her throat. No. 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 He knew. The crowd shifted, uncertain, looking at one another with confusion. "Master," Peter said, stepping closer to Jesus, his brow furrowed. "The people are crowding around you and pressing against you. How can you ask who touched you?" But Jesus did not look at Peter. He turned, his eyes scanning the faces before him, searching. "Someone touched me," he said again, his voice calm but certain. "I know that power has gone out from me." The crowd still. All around her, people looked at one another, murmuring, shaking their heads. And she stood frozen. Fear wrapped itself around her throat. She had hoped to go unnoticed. She had not meant to steal a miracle. What if she had done something wrong? What if she had angered him? What if she had taken something he had not meant to give? Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her robe. She could run. She could slip back into the crowd, disappear as she always had. But she had spent 12 years in hiding, and she could not hide anymore. She took a shaky breath, then stepped forward, falling at his feet, her body trembling. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "It was me, Lord!" She could not lift her head. She did not know what he would say. Would he be angry? Would he scold her? Would he tell her that she was unworthy? Her breath came in short gasps as she continued. "I have suffered for 12 years, she whispered. "No one could heal me. I spent everything I had, but nothing worked. And then I heard about you." Her voice broke. "I thought if I could only touch your robe, I would be healed." She hesitated, then looked up. "I did." Her hands clutched the fabric of her robe as she whispered, "And I was." The silence stretched long, and then he smiled. "Daughter," Jesus said gently, his voice filled with warmth, filled with something deeper than mere kindness. "Your faith has healed you." The word daughter settled over her like a balm. For 12 years she had been outcast, forgotten, unwanted, but now she was seen. Now she was named, now she was known. His eyes met hers, steady and full of something she had not felt in so long, compassion. "Go in peace," he said softly. "Your suffering is over." Her breath shuddered in her chest. Peace! She had forgotten what it felt like. Slowly she rose to her feet. The crowd, which had once pressed against her as though she were nothing, now stepped aside, watching her with something between awe and reverence. She did not slip away unnoticed. She did not hide. She lifted her head, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The past was behind her. 12 years of suffering, 12 years of being unseen, 12 years of waiting for a miracle. And today, she had received one, and she would never be the same again. The crowd parted around her, their whispers soft yet urgent, their eyes flickering between her and the man who had just called her daughter. She had spent 12 years living as if she did not exist, hiding in the corners of the world, afraid to be seen, and yet here she was, standing before Jesus, no longer unseen, no longer nameless, no longer bound by the weight of shame and suffering. She could still feel the warmth of his words lingering in the air. "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." She had come to him in desperation, believing she would have to steal her miracle, believing she was unworthy of anything more than a passing touch of his robe. But instead, he had stopped. He had turned. He had seen her, and he had not sent her away. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were no longer from sorrow. She did not have to run anymore. She was free. The murmurs in the crowd began to grow, voices rising with disbelief, with awe, with uncertainty. Wasn't that the woman who's been unclean for years? How is it possible? 12 years of suffering, and now she walks as if nothing was ever wrong? Jesus healed her, just like that. But he didn't even touch her. She touched him. A man's voice, filled with quiet amazement, broke through the noise. No, it wasn't just that she touched him. The people turned to look at him. It was because she believed. The words settled over them like dust on the dry road, heavy with meaning, with truth. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment was shifting, moving forward. A man came running, breathless, his face pale with urgency. He was pushing through the people, his eyes wide with panic as he stumbled toward Jesus. "Teacher, please!" he gasped. "My daughter, she's gone!" A hush fell over the crowd. Jairus, the synagogue leader who had come to Jesus earlier begging for him to heal his only child. He had left his home in desperation, falling at Jesus' feet, pleading for a miracle. Jesus had agreed to go with him, but then the woman had come. She had delayed him. And now, the girl was dead. The woman's heart clenched. Had she taken too much of his time? Had she cost this man his daughter? Jairus collapsed to his knees, his shoulders shaking. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She's already gone." The silence was thick, the weight of grief pressing down upon them. The woman felt it too, that familiar, crushing sorrow, that feeling of helplessness, the knowledge of time running out, of doors closing forever. But then, Jesus spoke. "Don't be afraid. Just believe." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. He had spoken them with such certainty, such authority, as if death itself did not matter, as if the finality of it was nothing more than a shadow that could be lifted. Just believe. The woman closed her eyes, the words settling into the deepest part of her heart, just as she had believed, just as she had been healed. The crowd thinned as Jesus left with Jairus, walking toward the house where mourning had already begun. The people who had gathered around him hesitated, unsure whether they should follow or stay behind, still caught between amazement and uncertainty. The woman stood among them, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart still pounding in the aftermath of what had happened. Would he do it again? Would he bring healing, this time not for one who was suffering, but for one who had already slipped into the grasp of death? A woman beside her spoke in a hushed tone. "Do you think he can?" The woman turned to her. A small smile tugged at her lips, her heart swelling with the certainty she had never known before today. "I know he can." In the house of Jairus, the wailing had already begun. The mourners had gathered, their voices rising and falling in sorrow, their cries echoing against the walls. The girl had died. The healers had left. The family had accepted the loss. But then Jesus arrived. The weeping halted as he stepped inside, his presence so steady, so sure, that even the weight of death seemed to shrink before him. And then he spoke, his voice cutting through the sorrow. "Why all this commotion and wailing?" he asked. "The child is not dead, but asleep." The mourners stared at him in disbelief, and then some of them laughed. But Jesus was not shaken. He turned to everyone in the room and told them to leave. Only Jairus, his wife, and a few of Jesus' disciples remained. Then, in the quiet that followed, he approached the child's still form. The woman had believed he could heal without a word, but now he spoke. "Talitha cum," he said softly, taking the girl's hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, a flutter of movement, a deep inhale, and the child sat up. Her mother gasped, a cry escaping her lips as she fell to her knees beside her daughter, clutching her close, sobbing into her hair. Jairus stood frozen, his hands shaking as he covered his mouth, as if afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid that if he blinked, the miracle would disappear. But it didn't. The girl was alive, whole, restored. "Give her something to eat," Jesus said with a smile. "She'll need her strength." And with that, the impossible had happened again. The woman, still standing in the streets, still feeling the warmth of her own healing in her body, did not have to see it to know. She felt it. She knew. The same Jesus who had seen her, who had healed her, had now touched another life. And he would not stop. That night she lay on her mat, staring up at the ceiling of her home, listening to the quiet she had once dreaded. But now, the silence did not feel empty. She was healed. She was whole. She was known. She had been cast out, forgotten, unseen for 12 years, but in a single moment, Jesus had called her daughter. And now, she had no doubt. Wherever he walked, life would follow. Because with him, there was no such thing as too late. With him, there was no such thing as hopeless. With him, even death itself had no power. And for the first time in 12 years, she closed her eyes and she slept in peace. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the rooftops of the village, casting long beams of light through the narrow alleys and market stalls, filling the air with warmth. For the first time in 12 years, she felt it fully. Not as a distant observer, not as someone standing just beyond reach, but as a woman who had been restored, as someone who belonged. She stepped out of her small home, feeling the weight of her steps differently, as if her feet touched the earth in a way they never had before. She could still hear his voice echoing in her mind, steady and full of power, yet wrapped in gentle kindness. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." The word daughter settled deep in her chest, filling the hollow places inside her, the ones that had been left empty for so long. She had not heard that word in years. She had no husband to call her beloved. She had no children to call her mother. And for the past 12 years, even her own family had not dared to call her daughter. But Jesus had. And he had said it in front of everyone. He had given her back the name that had been stolen from her by suffering, by shame, by the whispers of those who had cast her out. She had lived so long believing that her condition had made her invisible, that her suffering had made her unworthy. But the Son of God had seen her. And if he had seen her, if he had called her daughter, then she was not invisible. She never had been. The marketplace was already alive with movement, merchants arranging their goods, customers weaving through the narrow paths, laughter and conversation blending together like a song. She hesitated before stepping forward. The last time she had walked these streets, she had kept her head down, avoiding the glances of those who knew her, ducking into the shadows before they could pull their robes away and whisper behind their hands. But today, She walked openly. Her feet carried her past the fruit vendor, past the fishermen gutting their early morning catch, past the women gathered around the well, their hands wrapped around heavy jugs of water. She expected to hear whispers, expected to see the same recoiling expressions, the same looks of pity or quiet disgust. But the looks were different now. Curious, awestruck, disbelieving. And then, a voice. "You?" She turned, her breath catching for just a moment. A woman stood before her, a bundle of cloth in her arms, her brow furrowed, her lips slightly parted. She was familiar. One of the women who had once known her, who had once walked alongside her before the sickness had stolen everything away. "You?" The woman tried again, her voice uncertain. "It's you, isn't it?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. The woman exhaled sharply. "But how?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she describe what had happened in a way that could ever capture the weight of it? How could she explain the fear, the desperation, the moment she had reached for the hem of his robe? The way healing had rushed through her like a flood, the way she had known in the very marrow of her bones that she was whole before she had even looked down to see for herself. How could she explain the way he had stopped? The way he had looked at her, not as an interruption, not as an unclean woman who had stolen something from him, but as someone worth seeing, someone worth acknowledging? How could she explain that his voice had done more than just restore her body? It had restored her. "It was Jesus," she said finally, the words coming softly at first, but growing stronger as she spoke. "I touched his robe, and he healed me." The woman's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly. A murmur rippled through the others who had gathered nearby, drawn by the conversation. "Jesus? The rabbi? The healer?" She nodded again, more certain this time. Yes, Jesus of Nazareth. A man nearby scoffed under his breath. "That's impossible. You were sick for years. No one could heal you." "No one else could heal me," she corrected. "But he did." The man frowned, shaking his head, but he did not argue further. Another voice, softer, hesitant. "Did he?" The woman who had spoken swallowed hard, her hands twisting in the folds of her robe. "Did he know you touched him?" A pause, and then a smile. "Yes." The woman's breath hitched. "And he didn't rebuke you?" "No." The murmur grew louder. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some looked away as if uncertain what to think, but others leaned in closer. Because deep down, beneath their doubt, beneath their fear, beneath their long-held beliefs about what was possible and what was not, something was stirring. Something that had not stirred in them for a long time. Hope. The sun had risen higher now, the warmth pressing gently against her skin as she turned away from the murmuring crowd. She could have stayed, could have spoken more, could have answered their questions, could have let them reach for their own understanding of what had happened. But she had somewhere else she needed to go. For 12 years, she had avoided the temple courts. She had longed for them from a distance, had stood on the outskirts, watching others bring their offerings, watching them lift their hands in worship, watching them step freely into the presence of the Almighty while she remained cast aside. She had prayed, always. But she had not been able to enter, not until now. Her steps quickened, her heart racing as the path to the temple came into view. She did not know what she would say to the priests, if they would believe her, if they would welcome her back. But it did not matter. She had already been seen by the only one who mattered. She had already been called daughter by the only one who could make her whole. And nothing Nothing could take that away. Inside the temple, the priests moved through their daily tasks, their hands carefully handling the sacred elements, their voices murmuring prayers. The scent of incense filled the air, mingling with the warm scent of oil and the faint distant burning of sacrifices. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the cool stone of the temple wall. A priest noticed her approach, his eyes narrowing slightly, his hands pausing in their work. She had expected hesitation. She had expected uncertainty. But she did not expect the words that left her mouth next. "I was unclean," she said, her voice steady. "But now I am whole." The priest's brows furrowed. "How?" She inhaled deeply, the scent of incense filling her lungs. "Jesus of Nazareth." A silence stretched between them. Then the priest looked at her more closely. His gaze traveled over her face as if searching for something, as if trying to see if her words could possibly be true. And in that moment, for the first time in 12 years, she stepped forward, not as an outcast, not as a woman forgotten by time, not as someone unworthy of standing in the presence of God, but as a daughter. And this time, no one stopped her. The temple courtyard stretched wide before her, the polished stone beneath her feet still warm from the midday sun. She had spent years avoiding this place, watching it from afar, longing for what she had lost. But now, she stood here, inside, not as an outcast, not as someone unclean, but as a woman who had been restored. She took slow, measured steps, her hands clenched at her sides to keep from trembling. Every breath felt heavier, as if her body could not yet accept the freedom she had been given. A priest stepped toward her, his eyes wary, studying her as if unsure whether to believe what he saw. He was an older man, his beard streaked with silver, his robes lined with the intricate embroidery of his high standing. "You have come to make an offering?" His voice was low, careful. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes." The man glanced over his shoulder, exchanging a look with another priest before turning back to her. "And your purification?" She knew what he was asking. He wanted to know if she had followed the law, if she had performed the ritual cleansing required of women who had been unclean. For 12 years, she had been unable to take part in such ceremonies. She had been shut out from this very place because the bleeding had never stopped. But it had stopped now, because of him. She lifted her chin, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "I am already clean." The priest frowned. "Who has declared you clean?" A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. And then she spoke. "Jesus of Nazareth." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples outward. The priest's expression flickered, something between curiosity and disbelief. She had expected this reaction. She had seen the way people reacted to the stories of Jesus, the wonder, the uncertainty, the fear. Some believed, some doubted, and some, like the priests, did not know what to make of him at all. The older man studied her, his fingers twitching slightly as if he were resisting the urge to step away. "You claim he healed you?" She did not hesitate. "I don't just claim it, I know it." A younger priest standing nearby scoffed under his breath. "The healer from Nazareth, the one who touches lepers and eats with sinners." She turned to him, her heart pounding. "Yes, that Jesus." The words left her lips with more boldness than she had intended, but she did not regret them, because they were true. Jesus had touched the untouchable. He had restored the outcasts, and he had seen her. The older priest studied her a moment longer, then sighed, rubbing his temple as if suddenly tired. "If what you say is true, then make your offering. But know this." His gaze met hers sharply. "Not all in Jerusalem welcome his name." She already knew that. She had seen the way the Pharisees spoke of him, the way the religious leaders whispered about him. Their voices edged with something more than skepticism, something closer to fear, and she had also seen the way he did not flinch in their presence. She nodded. "I understand." But she did not fear them, because the one who had healed her was greater than all of them. The offering was simple, a pair of turtle doves purchased with the last of the coins she had. She watched as the priest took them, murmuring the words of purification, the scent of incense rising in thick curls into the air above the altar. For 12 years, she had been shut out of this moment. For 12 years, she had been told she was unworthy. For 12 years, she had waited. But not anymore. She was whole. She was seen. She was clean. The burden she had carried for over a decade, one of shame, of suffering, of isolation, was gone. And as the priest lifted his hand in blessing, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not even realized was still there. She bowed her head, and she gave thanks. As she stepped out of the temple courts, the late afternoon sunlight bathed the city in golden light. The air smelled of spices and fresh bread, and for the first time in years, she let herself enjoy it. She was walking freely now, no longer shrinking away from the people around her, no longer afraid of being seen. "Wait!" She turned at the sound of the voice. A woman hurried toward her, breathless, her face uncertain but hopeful. She was younger, perhaps no more than 17, with a small child on her hip, a boy no older than 3. The woman hesitated, glancing around nervously before lowering her voice. "I heard what you said. In the temple. About Jesus." The woman clutched the child against her chest, her fingers white-knuckled as they gripped his small frame. "My son. He was born with a twisted foot. He cannot walk. No physician has been able to help him. She exhaled shakily. "I have heard of Jesus, but I do not know if he would listen to someone like me." The woman swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Do you think he would?" The woman who had been healed did not hesitate. "Yes," she said simply. The younger mother blinked. "But how can you be so sure?" A smile touched her lips. "Because I know what it feels like to be unseen," she said softly. "And I know that Jesus sees the ones the world ignores." The younger woman pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Where can I find him?" she whispered. The woman who had been healed turned her gaze toward the horizon, where she knew Jesus was traveling from town to town, his hands touching the sick, his words reaching the broken. "He will come to you," she said, "or you will find him. But either way, he will see you." The young mother clutched her son tightly, nodding through her tears, and with that she turned, disappearing into the streets, her steps quick with new hope, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The woman who had been healed watched her go, her own heart swelling with something deep and unshakable. Jesus was not done. He was still moving, still healing, still seeing those who had been cast aside. And because of that, she knew her story was only the beginning. The city was alive with murmurs. The name of Jesus, passing through the streets like a wave, carried on the lips of merchants, beggars, and temple-goers alike. Some spoke with awe, their voices hushed in reverence, others with skepticism, their words sharp, questioning. And some with outright anger, their eyes dark with something deeper than disbelief, something closer to fear. She could hear it all. But for the first time, she did not flinch at the sound of his name spoken in doubt, because she knew. She had felt his power. She had heard his voice. She had been seen by him. And nothing could change what had happened. She sat near the well at the edge of the city, watching as people passed by, listening to the rhythm of their steps, the rise and fall of their voices. Did you hear? About the synagogue leader's daughter? Yes. He raised her from the dead. Impossible. That girl was truly gone. People were mourning her. The burial preparations had already begun. And yet she walks. She closed her eyes, allowing the words to settle in her heart. Jesus had done it again. He had done for that girl what he had done for her, restored her, made her whole, given her back the life that had been slipping away. But not everyone rejoiced. I do not trust him, another voice muttered nearby, low and dark. He defies the law. He eats with tax collectors, speaks with sinners, touches the unclean. He heals the unclean, another voice countered, but the first man scoffed. The priests are watching him closely. He is stirring trouble, and trouble leads to ruin. The Romans will not ignore a man like that for long. A quiet knot twisted in her stomach. The opposition was growing. She had seen it in the temple. The way the priests had looked at her when she spoke his name, the way they had exchanged silent glances, unwilling to challenge her healing, but unwilling to embrace it either. They could not deny what had happened, but that did not mean they would accept it. She sighed, shifting slightly on the worn stone of the well's edge. The days since her healing had moved quickly, one after another. But still, she could not bring herself to leave the city. Not yet. Something in her heart told her that Jesus would return, and when he did, she wanted to be there. She wanted to hear him again, to see him again, to understand more of the one who had changed everything for her. A shadow passed over her, and she looked up to see a man hesitating a few steps away. He was older, his robe worn but well kept, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in the bones. He shifted awkwardly as if unsure whether to speak. She recognized that hesitation. It was the hesitation of someone who wanted to ask something but feared the answer. You? He started, then stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. You are the woman who was healed. She studied him for a moment before nodding. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if he had been holding something in for too long. My wife, he said, voice rough with quiet desperation. She has been sick for years, not like you, but different. We have tried everything. He shook his head. I do not know if I believe in this Jesus, but He swallowed hard. I do not know what else to do. She let the words settle between them. She had lived in that place, the space between belief and desperation, where hope was so fragile that it felt dangerous to hold. She understood him more than he knew. She met his eyes. Find him, she said simply. Go to him. It does not matter how small your faith is. It only matters that you take the step. The man let out a slow breath, nodding slightly before turning and walking away, his pace uncertain but determined. She watched him go, her heart full, because she knew what he did not yet know. She knew that if he found Jesus, he would not be turned away, because Jesus never turned away those who came to him, and he never would. The evening stretched across the sky in soft strokes of orange and violet as she made her way back to her small home. But just before she reached her doorstep, she heard something. The distant murmur of a gathering. A crowd. Her pulse quickened. Could it be? She turned, following the sound, weaving through the streets, moving quickly toward the rising voices, and then, there, a familiar presence. Jesus. He had returned. She barely took a breath before she started forward, her heart pounding with something that was no longer fear, but something greater, joy. Because this time she was not coming to him in desperation. This time she was coming to listen. Because this time she was not broken. She was whole. The gathering was already thick with people by the time she arrived, voices rising in anticipation, bodies pressing in close, eager for the sound of his voice. She stood at the edges of the crowd, her heart racing, not with the desperation that had once driven her to him, but with something new, expectation. This time, she did not need to push forward. She did not need to reach for his robe in secret, to steal a healing, to disappear before anyone could see her. This time, she belonged here. She was one of them now, one of those who had been touched by him, changed by him, restored by him. And as she stood there, waiting, she saw him. Jesus. He moved through the crowd with the same calm presence he always carried, listening to the people, answering their questions, pausing to place his hands on the sick, to offer words of comfort, of wisdom, of truth. There was no hesitation in him, no exhaustion, no frustration at the way the people pressed in. He saw them, all of them, the broken, the weary, the forgotten, and he loved them, just as he had loved her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds around her fade as she thought back to that moment, the moment everything had changed. She had been lost in a sea of people, believing she was nothing more than a shadow. But Jesus had stopped. He had turned and he had looked for her. And in that single moment, he had proven what her heart had longed to believe, that she was never invisible to him, that he had always seen her. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Teacher," a man called from somewhere near the front, "what is the greatest commandment?" The murmurs in the crowd quieted. People leaned in, waiting for his answer. Jesus lifted his gaze, looking over the crowd, not just at the man who had asked, but at all of them. And then he spoke. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind," he said. "This is the first and greatest commandment." The people nodded, murmuring their agreement. But then he continued, "And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." The words were simple, but they sent a ripple through the people, quieting them in a way that no commandment had before. She felt them settle deep inside her. Love your neighbor. Love. Had that not been what he had given her? Not just healing, not just restoration, but love? He had stopped for her. He had spoken to her. He had called her daughter. And now he was telling them, all of them, that this was how they were to live, not by power, not by law, but by love. Tears pricked her eyes as she exhaled slowly, realizing something she had not before. For 12 years, she had believed she was cursed, that God had forgotten her, that her suffering was a sign of his absence. But now, she saw it. He had not forgotten her. He had prepared her. Had she not suffered, she would never have reached for him. Had she not reached for him, she would never have known his voice. Had she never known his voice, she would never have understood his love. And now she knew. Now she understood, not just for herself, but for others, for the ones who still stood in the shadows, believing they were unseen, for the ones who were still waiting for their moment to be restored, for the ones who had not yet found the courage to reach out, to touch the hem of his robe. She would find them. She would see them. She would love them, because Jesus had seen her first. The crowd was still pressing in, still moving forward, still reaching for him, and she could have stayed, could have pushed forward, could have waited for him to pass by so that she could hear his voice again. But instead, she turned and walked away. Not because she did not love him, but because now she carried him with her. She did not need to reach for him anymore, because he had already given her everything. And as she stepped back into the city, as she passed the marketplace, as she walked among the people who had once turned away from her, she saw them differently. She saw the way they held their burdens. She saw the sorrow in their eyes, the weight in their steps. And she knew somewhere among them, someone was waiting for the same miracle she had received. Someone needed to know that they were seen. Someone needed to hear the words he had spoken to her. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And she would tell them. She would find the ones the world ignored. She would remind them that there was one who had come for them, the one who always saw. And in that moment, she realized her story was not ending. It was just beginning.